When you imagine the Ottoman Empire, your mind may drift to vast palaces, sultans in golden robes, and the endless sweep of conquest across continents. But if you had lived in the empire around the 16th century, your daily reality would likely have been far less glamorous. You would have been a peasant in Anatolia, part of a vast rural population that formed the backbone of the empire, yet remained largely invisible in its histories. Life here was dictated not by the whims of sultans or the strategies of generals, but by seasons, soil, taxation, and the endless toil of survival. Your day would begin long before dawn. The rooster's crow, or more likely, the faint light of the morning sun, would mark the start of labor that could last until the sun disappeared behind the hills. In Anatolia, the land was both a blessing and a curse. Fertile valleys along rivers offered potential for crops, but uneven rainfall, rocky soil, and frequent droughts made farming a constant challenge. You would have lived in a small, mud brick or wooden home, often with only a single room shared by your extended family. The roof might leak during winter rains, and the floor would be bare earth, swept clean only occasionally. Your breakfast, if it could be called that, was simple. Perhaps a few bites of bread, sometimes barley or wheat if the harvest had been sufficient, and water or diluted milk. Meat was a rare luxury, consumed perhaps only once a week, often in salted or dried form. Vegetables might appear seasonally, depending on what survived the harsh Anatolian climate. You would not have eaten for pleasure, but out of necessity. Every bite was fuel for the long labor ahead. The work itself was relentless. You would tend small plots of wheat, barley, or lentils, often using wooden plows pulled by oxen. In vineyards and orchards, the labor was just as intense, pruning, harvesting, and protecting your plants from pests. Irrigation systems existed, but only sporadically, and much of the water had to be drawn by hand from wells or channels. Every season brought new challenges. Spring was for sowing, summer for constant watering and weeding, autumn for the exhausting harvest, and winter for repairs and preparation for the next cycle. You would have understood the rhythm of the year intimately, but it did not guarantee survival. A single failed harvest could lead to hunger or debt. Taxes were an omnipresent shadow over your life. The empire relied heavily on agricultural taxation, collected either in cash or in kind. You might owe a portion of your grain to the state, as well as additional payments to local landowners or tax farmers. These figures could feel arbitrary and harsh. A drought, a flood, or even a minor pest infestation might reduce your yield, but the tax collectors still demanded their share. Failure to pay could result in fines, confiscation, or, in extreme cases, imprisonment. The bureaucracy behind these taxes was both complex and unyielding, leaving little room for negotiation or leniency. Work did not end with the fields. You would also be responsible for household chores, chopping wood for fuel, fetching water, tending animals, and repairing your home. Many peasants kept chickens, goats, or sheep, both for food and for extra income. Winter presented its own hardships, with freezing temperatures and snow isolating villages and making travel difficult. Children, too, would work from a young age, learning the rhythms of labor almost as soon as they could walk. Education was limited. What you learned came from the land, from parents, and from the small, informal communities around you. You would not have had access to doctors as we know them today. Small injuries could become serious, illnesses were frequent, and epidemics could sweep through villages with little warning. Midwives and herbalists might offer some remedies, but their knowledge was limited and their reach inconsistent. Malnutrition was common, especially in years of poor harvest. Your body would have become hardened and resilient, accustomed to enduring discomfort, yet vulnerable to the smallest misfortune. Social life was minimal but vital. Villages formed small communities where survival depended on cooperation. You might gather with neighbors for shared labor, religious celebrations, or local markets. These gatherings provided relief from constant work and a chance to exchange news, though gossip could be as influential as the imam or village head. Festivals and holy days broke the monotony, but rarely offered any real escape from labor or hardship. For most, life was a cycle of work, eating what little was available, sleeping, and preparing for the next day. Despite the hardships, peasants developed small strategies for survival. Rotating crops, storing grain in hidden pits, and bartering with neighbors were all ways to hedge against the unpredictability of life. You learned patience and endurance, because nothing in your immediate surroundings could change overnight. Even small successes like a full harvest or a rare feast were deeply satisfying, though they offered only temporary relief from the relentless grind. You would also have noticed the slow but steady reach of Ottoman administration into your village. Officials might arrive occasionally to register land, enforce taxes, or collect reports for the central government. These visits were tedious and intimidating. Laws and decrees issued from Istanbul or Edirne could affect your daily life in ways that seemed distant and abstract, yet their consequences were immediate and tangible. A change in taxation policy could ruin a family, while a decree promoting irrigation or livestock breeding might pass largely unnoticed if your resources were insufficient to implement it. Life as a peasant in Anatolia was not merely difficult because of hunger or labor. It was also marked by monotony, a sense of invisibility, and the constant uncertainty of survival. Every season repeated the same patterns, yet each brought new threats: weather, taxation, illness, or crop failure. You lived intimately connected to the land, yet largely powerless over forces that shaped your existence. Your day-to-day life was largely unremarkable. Yet these ordinary experiences formed the foundation of the empire, producing the food, resources, and labor that allowed sultans and officials to govern distant lands. As night fell, you would lie on your thin mattress, exhausted, but unable to rest entirely. Thoughts of the next day would press on your mind, whether the weather would hold, whether the animals would survive the cold, and whether the tax collector would demand more than you could provide. Sleep offered temporary escape, yet it was always interrupted by the awareness that survival required constant vigilance and effort. And yet, amid this repetition and struggle, subtle patterns emerged. The growth of a crop, after careful tending, the quiet rhythm of communal work, and the occasional fleeting relief of a successful harvest. Life was both harsh and persistent. And in this persistence lay a strange kind of endurance. But you might wonder, what would happen when the pressures of taxation, labor, and climate combined in particularly brutal years? Could a family survive? Or would entire villages succumb to hardship, vanishing from the records of history, leaving only faint traces of their ordinary lives? As the seasons turned and years passed, the rhythm of peasant life in Anatolia remained predictable in its structure, yet precarious in its consequences. You began to notice, over decades, how subtle shifts in policy, climate, and local power could transform what seemed like mundane existence into crises of survival. Every change in the empire's administration, every new decree from Istanbul, and every adjustment in the tax quotas resonated in your village, often in ways you could scarcely anticipate. One of the most persistent pressures was taxation, which seemed to increase almost imperceptibly over time. The Ottoman tax system was complicated and multi-layered, combining state-imposed levies, provincial assessments, and local extractions. As a peasant, you were expected to pay the tithe, ushur, on a portion of your crops, sometimes a tenth, sometimes more, depending on the local arrangements. But this was not the whole picture. You might also owe taxes in cash, livestock, or labor, depending on your land tenure and the whims of local officials. Occasionally, the tax collector would arrive without warning, assessing your holdings and leaving you scrambling to meet the demands. Falling behind was dangerous. Fines, seizure of property, or forced labor could follow swiftly. Your understanding of taxation extended beyond numbers. It shaped every decision you made in the fields and in your household. Crops were chosen not only for suitability to the soil, but for the amount of tax they would generate. Lentils and barley might grow reliably, but offered little surplus to pay obligations. Wheat was more profitable, but risked failure under drought conditions. You learned to hedge your risks, planting a mix of crops and storing surplus grain in hidden caches. It was a game of probability, patience, and endurance, where a single season's failure could spiral into debt and hunger. The social structure of village life amplified these pressures. Ottoman villages were organized into mahalle or small communities, often with a local headman, muhtar, who acted as intermediary between peasants and the broader administration. Your interactions with the muhtar could determine whether a tax dispute escalated or subsided. Favor and reputation mattered, and nepotism or favoritism was common. Occasionally, local conflicts flared, whether over land boundaries, grazing rights, or water usage. These disputes were often minor, yet they required your attention and energy, adding tension to an already demanding life. Weather and climate were ever-present arbiters of your fate. Anatolia's terrain is varied. Mountains, plateaus, and valleys create microclimates that can drastically affect crop yields. In particularly dry summers, irrigation systems might fail, or wells run low, leaving your fields parched and your stored food insufficient. Hailstorms could devastate vineyards, and frost might strike unexpectedly in spring. These events were not merely inconveniences. They could determine whether your family survived or starved. You developed a cautious optimism, planting crops with care, but knowing that fortune often outweighed skill. The Ottoman state also encouraged certain agricultural practices that added labor to your already demanding life. You might be required to grow specific cash crops, such as cotton or silk, or to cultivate sugar beets in experimental plots, with little guidance or support. While these initiatives could increase imperial revenue, they often imposed extra labor on peasants with little tangible benefit. At times, you would observe neighboring villages struggling under similar directives, and wonder whether compliance would ultimately improve or worsen your prospects. Family labor was essential to survival. Every member of the household had responsibilities, and children contributed from a very young age. Boys might work the plough alongside their fathers, tend livestock, or transport water, while girls assisted with cooking, cleaning, and textile production. Extended families often lived together, pooling resources and labor to survive harsh winters or poor harvests. In such circumstances, kinship ties were more than social connections. They were economic necessities. Marriages were frequently arranged, not for love, but for alliance and labor consolidation, ensuring that each household could meet both social and economic obligations. Health and mortality were constant undercurrents of anxiety. Disease outbreaks, such as smallpox, dysentery, or influenza, could decimate villages, killing indiscriminately and leaving families in precarious positions. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Herbal remedies, advice from midwives, and visits to itinerant healers provided some relief, but serious illnesses often ended in death or permanent disability. Even minor injuries, left untreated, could become life-threatening. The combination of malnutrition, physical labor, and disease created a fragile equilibrium in which survival was never guaranteed. Yet daily life was not solely dominated by survival. Moments of human ingenuity and adaptation were scattered throughout. You and your neighbors would sometimes construct small irrigation canals, reinforce terraces to prevent soil erosion, or develop storage systems to protect grain from rodents and moisture. These actions required collaboration, ingenuity, in quiet ways. These efforts represented subtle forms of resistance to the uncontrollable pressures of empire, climate, and taxation. Religious and cultural practices offered both structure and solace. Friday prayers, seasonal festivals, and visits to local shrines punctuated the monotonous rhythm of labor. You would attend ceremonies, not merely for devotion, but as a social outlet, opportunities to meet others, exchange news, or reaffirm communal bonds. In some villages, local oral traditions preserved memories of historical events, clever solutions to agricultural problems, or moral lessons for young members of the community. These practices were not grand or heroic, but they helped maintain resilience and identity amid relentless labor. Trade and market access were intermittent but critical. Many peasants produced more than they could consume, and small markets allowed for bartering grain, livestock, or textiles. Yet the journey to market was arduous, often taking a full day of travel along rough roads, with the risk of theft or spoilage along the way. Successful trade could supplement your meager resources, but the effort required often outweighed the benefits. You learn to calculate risk carefully, deciding when to sell, when to barter, and when to consume your produce at home. Throughout all this, the Ottoman state remained both distant and intrusive. Central policies, provincial decrees, and tax quotas could affect your life in subtle and unpredictable ways. Peasants often had limited knowledge of the broader political context. Wars, diplomatic agreements, or changes in leadership in Istanbul seemed abstract, yet their consequences, requisitioning of food, conscription of young men, or imposition of new taxes, were immediate and unavoidable. You learned to navigate these shifts pragmatically, focusing on what you could control and accepting what you could not. Despite the monotony and hardship, resilience and adaptation were constant features of peasant life. You became intimately aware of the limits of endurance and the capacity of the human body to adjust to deprivation. You developed strategies for coping with uncertainty, whether storing grain, diversifying crops, or negotiating with neighbors and local officials. Survival depended on observation, experience, and a willingness to persist, often in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet one question lingered at the back of your mind, growing with each passing season. While your family endured, toiled, and survived minor disasters, what would happen if the pressures compounded, if taxation increased, the weather failed, and illness struck simultaneously? Could an individual household truly withstand the cumulative weight of these challenges? Or would entire villages vanish quietly from the map, leaving little evidence of their existence? The answers were uncertain, and the fate of ordinary people in Anatolia remained delicately balanced, caught between the demands of the empire and the unpredictability of nature. By the time several decades had passed, you would have witnessed cycles of abundance and scarcity repeat with almost hypnotic regularity. Each year, the same rituals of sowing, tending, and harvesting shaped your existence, while subtle changes in weather, administration, and circumstance could shift life from manageable to desperate. Survival was not guaranteed, yet most peasants in Anatolia found ways to persist, and persistence itself became a defining feature of daily life. Your strategies for survival had evolved over the years. You had learned which crops could endure droughts, which plots required more effort for better returns, and how to store grain without it spoiling or being stolen. Hidden caches in your home or secret storage pits in the fields became vital safety nets. Bartering with neighbors allowed for access to goods you could not produce yourself, and extended family networks ensured that no one in your household went entirely without help. You learned to read the land, observing subtle changes in soil color, plant growth, and animal behavior to anticipate challenges before they became crises. Yet even with these skills, the empire's demands remained relentless. Tax collection cycles were unyielding, and failures, whether caused by drought, illness, or pestilence, could escalate quickly. You may have seen neighbors lose their land or possessions, their families dispersing to nearby villages or distant towns in search of survival. Some peasants were forced to sell young children into servitude, a heartbreaking solution to unpayable debts. Others abandoned marginal land entirely, leaving terraces to crumble and fields to return to wild growth. Survival was a delicate balance, contingent on vigilance, skill, and sheer luck. Despite the hardships, life in Anatolia was not entirely bleak. Small victories punctuated the monotony. A successful harvest could mean a modest surplus to trade at the local bazaar, a small celebration after a festival, or the ability to pay taxes without fear of retribution. You may have participated in communal repairs, religious celebrations, or the construction of irrigation canals that benefited the entire village. These moments offered not only material benefit, but also psychological relief, a reassurance that your labor, though arduous, had meaning and impact. In quiet ways, these victories reflected a subtle form of agency amid the rigid structures of empire and environment. Generational continuity was another measure of resilience. You might have watched your children grow, taking on responsibilities early, learning the ways of the land and the rhythms of labor. While education in reading and writing was rare for peasants, practical knowledge, crop rotation, animal husbandry, and resource management was transmitted carefully from one generation to the next. The wisdom of survival was encoded, not in books, but in daily practice, ensuring that families could persist even when external and conditions threatened their existence. Over time, you may have seen small improvements in technique or minor adjustments to crop choices that reflected decades of accumulated experience. However, the broader social and political realities of the empire were always present, shaping the environment in which you lived. Military campaigns could remove young men from the village, taking them to distant battlefields or recruiting them into the janissaries. Epidemics might strike without warning, leaving only a few survivors to manage vast tracts of abandoned land. Provincial officials often implemented reforms or new tax structures without consideration for local conditions, creating sudden hardships. The Ottoman state's reach was extensive yet uneven, and the weight of imperial bureaucracy could press down upon even the most resilient peasant. What emerges clearly from decades of such ordinary existence is a portrait of life defined by persistence rather than progress. Peasants endured, not because they were free to shape their own destinies, but because endurance was the only option. Daily life demanded constant labor, careful observation, and creative problem-solving. The subtle innovations, shared knowledge, and social cohesion within villages represented a quiet resistance to adversity, a testament to human resilience in the face of unrelenting pressure. Yet the endurance of ordinary life also carried a paradox. While peasants survived and adapted, their stories often left little trace in the historical record. Whole villages could disappear following a particularly harsh famine or epidemic, leaving only administrative notes, land surveys, or tax registers to hint at the lives that had once existed. In this way, history frequently remembers only the sultans, generals, and bureaucrats, while the millions of people who actually produced the empire's wealth remain largely invisible. The mundane details of their labor, harvesting grain, repairing roofs, tending goats were the foundation upon which empires were built, yet they are rarely celebrated. As you reflect on this ordinary life, you realize that the Ottoman Empire was not only shaped by monumental battles or political intrigue, but also by the quiet, repetitive efforts of countless peasants. Every loaf of bread, every basket of grain, every repaired roof represented unseen labor that allowed distant rulers to govern and armies to march. The persistence of the peasant was the invisible engine of the empire, and yet it came at a profound human cost. Exhaustion, vulnerability, and the constant negotiation with forces beyond one's control. In the end, what remains remarkable is not heroism or glory, but survival itself. You may never know the names of the families who lived in your village centuries ago, yet their endurance ensured the continuity of life across generations. Their experience teaches a subtle lesson. History is as much about the ordinary as it is about the fanned, extraordinary, and the rhythms of survival, though often invisible, shape the course of human events in ways that powerful leaders seldom recognize. And so, as the sun set over Anatolia and the day's labor ended, you might have wondered, even when life seems monotonous, exhausting, and entirely governed by forces beyond your control, what does the quiet endurance of ordinary people say about the true backbone of empires? And, by extension, the resilience of humanity itself. When you hear the word Ottoman Empire, images of grand palaces, majestic mosques, and military conquest might immediately spring to mind. What you might not imagine, however, is the hidden engine behind the empire's vast wealth, the meticulous, often tedious, collection of taxes from its subjects. If you were a farmer, merchant, or craftsman in the 16th or 17th century, you would have been acutely aware of the empire's reach, not through soldiers, but through paperwork, collection visits, and the relentless extraction of resources. Life for ordinary people was structured, in large part, around the tedium of tax obligations, and understanding this system reveals a great deal about the quiet forces that sustained one of history's largest empires. At its core, the Ottoman taxation system was designed to convert the labor and production of millions into the revenue needed to maintain government, military, and infrastructure. Unlike modern taxation, which tends to involve a small percentage of income or consumption, Ottoman taxes were layered, specific, and tied directly to land, production, and even personal status. The Timar system, for instance, allocated land to cavalrymen, sipahis, who collected taxes locally in exchange for military service. For a peasant, this meant that a portion of every crop you produced was automatically owed to a local sipahi, regardless of your own consumption needs. Failure to provide these taxes could result in fines, confiscation of land, or, worse, beyond Timar obligations, other forms of tax proliferated across the empire. There was the sizye, a tax levied on non-Muslims in exchange for protection and exemption from military service, and various customs duties, which applied to goods moving through markets, ports, and roads. Some villages were subject to additional levies imposed by local governors, or tax farmers, iltizam holders, who purchased the right to collect taxes for a specific region. These systems were highly organized, yet could feel arbitrary and oppressive. For ordinary villagers, the complexity was overwhelming. Different crops, land plots, and family members could each carry distinct obligations. Imagine being a peasant in a small Anatolian village. You might cultivate wheat, barley, and lentils while tending goats or sheep. The state, the sipahi, and possibly local officials would all have claims on your produce. Your taxes could be levied in grain, livestock, or cash, often determined by strict formulas that left little room for negotiation. If the harvest was poor, you would still be expected to meet obligations, forcing you to sell or barter portions of your produce, borrow from neighbors, or work extra hours to cover the deficit. The constant accounting, calculation, and risk assessment became an inescapable part of daily life. Tax collectors, often arriving unexpectedly, were the human face of this system. They carried lists, ledgers, and forms, meticulously recording each peasant's contributions. These officials were rarely sympathetic to the hardships of rural life. Their goal was not to consider individual circumstances, but to ensure that quotas were met. A missed payment could have cascading consequences: fines for underpayment, seizure of goods, or even physical punishment in extreme cases. The mere presence of these collectors induced a state of perpetual anxiety in villages, as if the empire itself was silently observing every furrow, goat, and bushel of grain. For merchants, taxation was equally pervasive, though differently structured. Trade within the empire required the payment of gumruk, customs duties, at city gates, river crossings, or caravanserais. These fees were often assessed as a percentage of the value of goods, but enforcement varied, and disputes could lead to bribes, fines, or confiscation. Merchants had to maintain meticulous records of transactions, taxes owed, and payments made, often keeping multiple sets of accounts to satisfy competing authorities. Traveling between towns for trade was as much an exercise in navigating bureaucracy as it was in transporting goods. A small error could result in financial ruin or legal entanglement. The psychological weight of taxation cannot be understated. For peasants, merchants, and artisans alike, life was structured around meeting obligations to multiple layers of authority. Even when production exceeded immediate needs, the surplus rarely translated into comfort or security. Every extra bushel of grain, every coin earned in a marketplace, was assessed and often redirected to the state's coffers. Survival required not only physical labor, but constant vigilance, calculation, and compromise. Interestingly, the Ottoman state was aware of these pressures and occasionally attempted reforms to balance extraction with sustainability. Land surveys, tax adjustments, and periodic audits aimed to standardize collection and prevent extreme abuses. Yet these reforms often introduced new complications. Standardized assessments could ignore local conditions, punishing villages during droughts or poor harvests. Administrative inefficiencies meant that officials might double count obligations or fail to account for previous payments. You would find yourself constantly reconciling state records with local realities, a never-ending exercise in bureaucratic endurance. Despite the burdens, the taxation system had subtle, unintended benefits for some. Peasants who cultivated surplus efficiently could engage in limited trade, using their produce to secure needed goods or resources. Merchants who mastered record-keeping, navigation of bureaucratic channels, and relationships with officials could accumulate modest wealth and influence. Some villages developed collective strategies, pooling resources to pay taxes on time or negotiating directly with collectors to reduce penalties. These adaptations required ingenuity, cooperation, and a thorough understanding of the administrative machinery of the empire. Yet for many, the monotony and predictability of taxation became oppressive. Each season was a cycle of sowing, harvesting, accounting, and paying, with little opportunity for relief. Even festive periods or religious holidays offered only temporary respite, as obligations resumed with the next cycle of crop production or trade. For children growing up in this system, the rhythm of life was learned early. Work, calculation, survival, repeat. Their education was grounded less in reading and writing, and more in arithmetic, negotiation, and understanding the fine details of local law and imperial decree. Furthermore, the accumulation of unpaid taxes could have catastrophic effects on entire communities. A single bad harvest or an inability to meet obligations could cascade through a village, triggering fines, confiscations, or forced labor. Neighboring families were often affected, either through shared responsibilities or collective penalties. The threat of punitive action was not abstract. It was immediate, tangible, and capable of reshaping village demographics within a single season. In extreme cases, villages could be abandoned entirely, their lands sold or redistributed, leaving only faint traces in imperial records. Even as you became accustomed to the routine, a subtle tension always persisted. The more you worked and produced, the more was extracted. Your labor sustained distant governors, soldiers, and the Sultan himself, yet your family's survival remained uncertain. In this way, the Ottoman taxation system created a paradoxical relationship. Prosperity, generated from peasant labor, was both a blessing and a curse. While it allowed the empire to flourish and fund its military campaigns, it also entrenched a state of ongoing anxiety and physical exertion. for ordinary people. And so, as night fell over Anatolia or the bustling streets of a provincial town, you might pause in fleeting reflection. You could calculate your taxes, consider how to protect your harvest, or think of the next caravan journey. But even as you planned, questions lingered. How many villages had quietly disappeared under the weight of taxation? How many families had survived by only the thinnest margin? Their labor silently sustaining an empire, while their names vanished from history. The answers were obscured in ledgers, bureaucratic forms, and records of distant officials, leaving you to wonder how ordinary people truly endured under the relentless demands of an empire built on extraction. By the second decade of life under Ottoman rule, the patterns of taxation had become more than routine. They were a central axis around which the rhythm of daily existence revolved. You learned to anticipate not only the arrival of the sipahi or tax collector, but also the subtler consequences of each transaction, each payment, and each error. The empire's bureaucratic machinery, though impressive in scale, was unforgiving in its insistence on order, and the cumulative effect of its demands shaped the physical, economic, and emotional life of every subject. One of the most pervasive effects of this system was the cultivation of prudence, or, more accurately, cautious calculation. Every decision you made in the fields, workshop, or marketplace was influenced by the question, how will this affect my taxes? Even the seemingly mundane choice of which seeds to plant or which animals to breed carried profound implications. Wheat, which might produce the greatest surplus, also carried higher expectations for tax contributions. Lentils or barley were safer bets, but they offered minimal surplus for trade or storage. In many ways, the empire trained its subjects not through coercion alone, but through careful structuring of incentives. A silent pedagogy of fiscal obedience. Merchants, meanwhile, experienced the same pressures in a more complex form. Trade routes crisscrossed the empire, connecting Anatolia with the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. Along these routes, multiple layers of taxation awaited. Customs duties at city gates, tolls on bridges and caravanserais, and levies imposed by provincial governors. A single caravan of goods might be subject to at least 5 separate tax points. You had to maintain detailed ledgers, tracking not only income and expenses, but also previous payments and local regulations, which often shifted unpredictably. An error in calculation could mean confiscation of goods or fines large enough to bankrupt a merchant. Success depended as much on bureaucratic acumen as on trading skill, and the constant vigilance required could be exhausting. Social structures within villages were deeply intertwined with taxation. Peasants often relied on collective strategies to navigate obligations. Families pooled resources to meet payments, lending grain or cash to neighbors whose harvests had failed. Villages sometimes negotiated as a unit with local officials, seeking reductions or deferrals. Such cooperation was vital, but could also create tension. Disagreements over contribution amounts, perceived fairness, or leadership roles often led to minor conflicts that required careful mediation. In these ways, taxation shaped not only economic life but social relationships, reinforcing interdependence while also producing friction. The Ottoman bureaucracy itself added layers of complexity. Provincial officials maintained registers of land, population, and production, which were periodically updated through surveys called Tahrir Defterleri. These records determined taxation quotas and could affect whether a family remained solvent or fell into debt. While the surveys aimed at standardization, errors and inconsistencies were common. A family might be recorded with more land than it actually held, leading to excessive tax demands, or officials might miscount crops, causing disputes. Resolving such discrepancies required travel to provincial centers, negotiation with officials, and sometimes appeals to distant courts. An arduous process that could take months or years, and that few peasants were equipped to pursue successfully. Environmental factors further complicated the calculus. A single drought, pest infestation, or harsh winter could devastate a village's ability to meet tax obligations. Ottoman administrators rarely adjusted quotas for local conditions. The bureaucracy demanded figures, not explanations. Some villages relied on hidden reserves, while others borrowed from wealthier neighbors or local moneylenders. Debt could accumulate quickly, and when repayment was impossible, officials might seize livestock, tools, or even land. In the most extreme cases, families were forced to abandon their villages, migrating to urban centers, frontier territories, or other provinces in search of subsistence. Such displacements were subtle yet profound, leaving little trace in historical narratives, yet shaping demographics and settlement patterns over centuries. Yet within this tedium, small forms of resistance emerged. You and your neighbors might conceal grain, manipulate records, or negotiate alternative payments with sympathetic officials. Some peasants diversified production, planting crops that were less taxed, or keeping hidden livestock to buffer against unexpected levies. Merchants developed networks of trusted intermediaries, using relationships and local knowledge to circumvent excessive duties. These adaptations were not acts of rebellion in a conventional sense. They were survival strategies, a quiet negotiation with the impersonal machinery of empire. Psychological effects were equally profound. The perpetual calculation, uncertainty, and fear of punitive measures produced a subtle but enduring anxiety. Peasants lived in a state of cautious vigilance, measuring every decision against potential consequences. Merchants endured chronic stress, balancing profitability against compliance with ever-changing regulations. Even those who successfully navigated the system experienced a sense of limited autonomy. Their labor primarily benefited authorities far removed from their villages, while the rewards for careful planning were modest at best. In this way, the empire imposed not only material obligations, but a psychological one, a constant awareness of subordination, risk, and responsibility. Religious and communal life, while offering moments of relief, was also shaped by taxation. Non-Muslim communities paid jizya, creating a formalized hierarchy in which financial obligation was intertwined with social status. Festivals, religious observances, and communal gatherings were tempered by the ongoing demands of fiscal survival. Celebrations might be muted if taxes had been particularly onerous, and debts could overshadow any opportunity for joy. The mundane rhythms of accounting and obligation subtly infiltrated all aspects of daily existence. Over time, patterns of inequity became visible. Larger landowners, skilled merchants, and officials had avenues to reduce their effective tax burden through personal connections, strategic maneuvering, or exploitation of loopholes. Smaller peasants and less connected traders bore the brunt of extraction, often operating at the margins of subsistence. These disparities contributed to gradual social stratification within villages and towns, reinforcing hierarchies and concentrating risk, and vulnerability among those least equipped to manage it. Survival required not only labor, but insight into local politics, personal relationships, and the quirks of bureaucracy. A complex skill set that few could fully master. And yet, despite these pressures, ordinary people persisted. Villages endured through collective effort. Merchants found ways to maintain trade, and families adapted to fluctuating demands. The strategies of concealment, negotiation, and diversification became second nature. Success was measured not by wealth, but by survival, by the ability to meet obligations, maintain food stores, and ensure that children could reach adulthood. Over decades, this quiet persistence became the backbone of Ottoman administration, enabling the empire to fund armies, build infrastructure, and maintain political stability, while ordinary subjects toiled largely unrecognized. Still, a lingering question remained, echoing across generations. What happened when the layers of taxation, environmental stress, and social obligation compounded too heavily? How many families were quietly displaced, villages abandoned, or lives disrupted, leaving only faint traces in the administrative records. And how did these small, cumulative pressures shape the broader trajectory of the empire, influencing settlement patterns, economic stability, and the resilience of ordinary people? These questions remained unresolved, quietly pressing on the consciousness of anyone living under the empire's meticulous, often exhausting system of extraction. As decades passed, the cumulative effect of Ottoman taxation on ordinary people. For peasants, merchants, and artisans alike, the empire was a constant presence in daily life, manifested not in armies or battles, but in the meticulous accounting of obligations. The sipahi, the provincial official, the tax farmer, all were reminders that labor, production, and trade existed first to serve the state. Yet within this framework of extraction, small strategies of adaptation and resilience emerged, quietly shaping the social and economic fabric of the empire. Peasants refined techniques for managing both production and taxation. Grain stores were meticulously organized. Some households developed secret reserves or alternative food caches to survive poor harvests. Crop rotation and diversification became standard practices, designed to hedge against droughts, pests, and the unpredictable nature of state demands. Families worked collectively, with children contributing from a young age, ensuring that no one person bore the full burden of labor. Even minor innovations, such as small-scale irrigation or the improvement of terraces, were undertaken not only for productivity, but to satisfy obligations and mitigate risk. Survival required foresight, collaboration, and careful calculation. Merchants, similarly, adapted to the tedium of tax obligations. Some developed extensive networks of intermediaries to navigate complex trade routes and multiple layers of taxation. Others kept meticulous ledgers, tracking not only goods and income, but prior payments, exemptions, and informal agreements with officials. Market knowledge, bureaucratic skill, and social connections became as essential to success as the ability to source or transport goods. For those who mastered these systems, modest wealth and influence were possible. But the margin for error was narrow, and mistakes could be devastating. Taxation also had broader social consequences. Inequities in the system reinforced local hierarchies. Well-connected families could mitigate obligations or exploit loopholes, while poorer households bore disproportionate burdens. Village dynamics reflected these disparities, as collective efforts to meet obligations created dependence on wealthier neighbors or local leaders. At the same time, these pressures fostered a degree of cohesion. Survival demanded negotiation, collaboration, and careful attention to social bonds. Ordinary life became a complex balance between individual labor, communal responsibility, and imperial oversight. Yet even as adaptation ensured survival, taxation had its costs. Constant calculation and labor under the pressure of obligations produced a subtle, persistent stress. Village festivals, religious observances, and daily routines were all influenced by fiscal realities. Success was measured not in comfort or prosperity, but in the ability to meet obligations without falling into debt or jeopardizing subsistence. The rewards of diligence were modest, often no more than temporary security or the avoidance of punitive measures. The empire itself benefited enormously from this system. Taxes extracted from peasants, merchants, and artisans funded armies, administration, and monumental architecture. The Ottoman state could project power across continents, wage wars, and maintain political stability, in part because of the disciplined, often invisible labor of its subjects. Yet the price of this stability was borne by the ordinary people, whose lives were shaped by forms, ledgers, and the perpetual rhythm of dues. While sultans and officials occupied the grand stages of history, it was these small, persistent contributions that made empire possible. Despite the burden, the system also demonstrated human resilience. Families endured cycles of scarcity, devised creative solutions, and maintained social cohesion. Villages survived poor harvests and bureaucratic errors, often through collective effort and ingenuity. Merchants navigated a labyrinth of levies and duties, ensuring trade continued despite administrative obstacles. These patterns reveal a subtle truth about history. Ordinary people, through patience, calculation, and cooperation, sustained the empire in ways that were largely invisible to contemporary observers and often absent from historical narratives. Yet, questions linger. How many villages disappeared quietly under the cumulative weight of taxes, debt, and environmental stress? How many families survived by the narrowest of margins, their daily toil ensuring the continuity of state structures while leaving no trace in historical memory? And how did these patterns of extraction and adaptation shape the long-term resilience of both the people and the empire? The answers are embedded in ledgers, local narratives, and the faint traces of communities that once existed, testaments to endurance and the quiet, often invisible forces that supported imperial power. Ultimately, the story of taxation in the Ottoman Empire is a story of tension between survival and obligation, between labor and reward, between ordinary lives and imperial ambitions. It reminds us that history is rarely made only by generals or rulers. It is also written by those who, day after day, manage the mundane and the tedious, whose work allows empires to function, wars to be waged, and civilizations to persist. The invisible backbone of the Ottoman Empire was built not from conquest alone, but from the persistent, meticulous labor of ordinary people under constant fiscal pressure, a lesson about endurance, adaptation, and the subtle mechanics of historical power. And so, as you consider the rhythm of these lives, the sowing, the accounting, the paying, the surviving, you may ask yourself, how many empires, past or present, have relied on similar, quiet, tireless labor to sustain their power? And how many of those ordinary lives, their struggles, and their ingenuity have been lost to history, leaving us to reconstruct their existence only through the meticulous remnants of tithes, tributes, and taxes? When most people imagine the Ottoman Empire, they picture grand palaces, towering minarets, and sweeping armies conquering distant lands. What rarely comes to mind is the vast, labyrinthine bureaucracy that underpinned all of these achievements. A system so complex and meticulous that without it, the empire could not have functioned. If you were an official within this administrative machinery, or even a subject occasionally caught in its reach, your life would have been defined by papers, registers, ledgers, and decrees. And for ordinary people, this bureaucracy was invisible, yet inescapable, governing everything from taxation to land tenure, trade, and social obligations. The Ottoman bureaucracy was a sprawling, hierarchical institution, organized to manage a state that stretched across 3 continents at its height. At the top, the Sublime Porte in Istanbul coordinated imperial policy, issued decrees, and directed provincial governors. Below this central authority were provincial administrations, eyalets, and later vilayets. Each tasked with local governance, tax collection, and legal administration. Each province contained subdivisions, districts, sub-districts, villages, each with its own officials, scribes, and intermediaries. Every level relied on meticulous record-keeping to ensure that instructions from Istanbul were implemented accurately, and that revenue, manpower, and resources flowed as expected. For officials and scribes, the core of their work was paperwork. Registers of land, population, and production, known as Tahrir Defterleri, were compiled through surveys that assessed each village, household, and cultivated plot. These surveys documented not only land ownership and crop yields, but also the presence of livestock, artisans, and non-Muslim residents subject to the Sizye tax. Mistakes in these records could have serious consequences. A village undercounted might be exempted from obligations temporarily, while an overcount could bring punitive tax assessments. Accuracy mattered profoundly, and the labor involved was meticulous and exhausting. You, if you were a scribe, would spend hours transcribing measurements, copying previous registers, and calculating quotas. Ink-stained fingers and cramped hands were common complaints. Each entry required precision. A single error could disrupt the chain of collection, create disputes, or even result in disciplinary action. Scribes were also responsible for drafting official correspondence, recording decrees, and maintaining ledgers for taxes, trade, and judicial rulings. The bureaucracy demanded consistency, repetition, and a kind of relentless patience that few outside the system could appreciate. For ordinary villagers or merchants, the bureaucracy was often experienced as intrusion. A tax collector might arrive with a ledger, demanding to compare your grain, livestock, or goods against previous records. Any discrepancy, whether due to a miscount, loss, or natural disaster, could result in fines or confiscation. You might be required to travel to a provincial office to resolve disputes, presenting documentation and negotiating with officials whose interpretations of the law were sometimes rigid, sometimes arbitrary. Even seemingly minor tasks, like transferring land rights or registering a fiver, a new family member, involved navigating multiple layers of paperwork. The bureaucratic machinery also extended into judicial and legal processes. Qadis, or local judges, were tasked with interpreting Islamic law and imperial decrees, often relying on records maintained by scribes. Legal disputes over land, inheritance, or contracts required extensive documentation, and cases could take months or years to resolve. For ordinary people, this meant that justice was slow and tedious, contingent on the accuracy of records, and often biased toward those who understood the system or had access to influential officials. Even when fairness prevailed, the procedural tedium shaped daily life, requiring patience, observation, and a careful record of interactions. Trade and commerce were heavily regulated through bureaucratic oversight. Merchants moving goods between towns or across provincial borders had to submit documents specifying the nature, quantity, and value of their products. Caravanserais often served as checkpoints where officials inspected paperwork, collected duties, and recorded transactions. Any discrepancy, intentional or accidental, could result in fines or confiscation. Maintaining multiple sets of records became standard practice. One for the state, one for personal accounting, and one as backup in case of disputes. This system ensured order, but demanded constant attention and labor from merchants, many of whom were more accustomed to trading goods than handling paper. Even within the bureaucracy itself, paperwork created a culture of redundancy and verification. Multiple copies of records were maintained to prevent loss or tampering, often requiring officials to cross-reference data across several registers. Every action tax collection, trade inspection, land transfer, judicial ruling generated documentation, contributing to a vast web of administrative detail. For those tasked with maintaining this network, life was consumed by counting, recording, calculating, and double-checking. Success required diligence, attention to minutiae, and the ability to tolerate repetitive, often monotonous work. The human cost of this system extended beyond officials and scribes. Ordinary people faced delays, disputes, and the constant need to produce accurate information. A poor harvest, unexpected death, or miscommunication could have repercussions amplified by the bureaucracy. Even small villages had to maintain awareness of regulations and record-keeping requirements, often learning through trial and error how to satisfy officials without overextending themselves. Adaptation became essential. Memorizing forms, observing patterns in inspections, and cultivating relationships with sympathetic officials were strategies for survival in a system that could appear cold and impersonal. Despite its tedium, the bureaucracy was essential to the empire's functioning. It allowed the Ottoman state to collect taxes, organize military, conscription, adjudicate disputes, and oversee far-flung territories with relative coherence. For ordinary subjects, the system's demands shaped daily life, dictating rhythms of labor, trade, and legal compliance. It also created subtle channels of influence. Those who mastered the paperwork, understood regulations, and navigated administrative hierarchies could gain advantages, whether in trade, property management, or social standing. And yet, even as the empire relied on this machinery, it was inherently fragile. Errors, miscommunication, or corruption could disrupt the flow of revenue and resources, leaving villages overburdened or merchants penalized unfairly. The balance between strict adherence to procedure and the practical realities of life was delicate, and small disruptions could ripple through the system with unintended consequences. You might wonder, if the bureaucracy was so meticulous, how often did human error, natural disaster, or local negotiation undermine it? And more importantly, how did ordinary people, caught in the gears of this administrative machine, manage to survive, adapt, and occasionally thrive despite the relentless paperwork that governed their lives? As you became more familiar with the empire's bureaucracy, you would notice that its influence extended far beyond mere record-keeping. It shaped almost every aspect of life, from land tenure to commerce, social hierarchy, and even personal relationships. For peasants, merchants, and officials alike, understanding the system became a daily necessity. The sheer volume of paperwork, inspections, and audits meant that survival often depended on patience, observation, and careful documentation. For peasants, bureaucracy was most evident in matters of land and taxation. Your small plot of farmland was not just a source of sustenance, it was a document in the empire's intricate administrative web. The Tahrir Defterleri recorded who owned each field, the expected yield, and the taxes owed. A misrecorded plot could spell disaster. You might be assigned a higher tax burden than your neighbors, or land might be reassigned entirely if errors were discovered. Maintaining personal records of past payments and harvests became a practical necessity. Even seemingly minor mistakes, miscounting a bushel of wheat, failing to record a livestock birth, could ripple through the system, creating disputes and potential fines. Life became a delicate negotiation between the realities of agricultural production and the rigid expectations of administrative oversight. Merchants faced similar challenges, though the paperwork they managed was far more complex. Trade within and across the empire involved customs duties, local taxes, caravanserai registrations, and multiple layers of documentation. Each shipment required meticulous record-keeping, often in triplicate, to satisfy local inspectors, provincial officials, and central authorities. A discrepancy of even a few coins or an inaccurate quantity could result in confiscation or fines. Merchants quickly learned that the bureaucracy was not just a system of enforcement, but a landscape to navigate strategically. Alliances with officials, memorization of local procedures, and careful management of ledgers could mean the difference between modest profit and financial ruin. For scribes and officials, the demands of the bureaucracy were relentless. Surveys had to be conducted and recorded accurately, correspondence drafted and copied, and records maintained for future audits. The system relied on human diligence at every step, and errors, whether clerical mistakes, miscalculations, or even simple fatigue, could propagate through the empire. You would have seen scribes working long hours, ink-stained fingers trembling with exhaustion, their attention consumed by repetition, yet acutely aware that the smallest oversight could lead to punitive measures or bureaucratic chaos. The bureaucracy also imposed a subtle but persistent psychological weight. Ordinary subjects lived in constant awareness that their actions, labor, and property were being recorded, assessed, and evaluated. This awareness shaped behavior. Crops were planted with taxation in mind, transactions conducted with precision, and interactions with officials approached with caution. The empire trained its subjects in the habits of meticulous accounting and compliance, embedding bureaucratic discipline into daily life. Over time, this generated a culture of procedural vigilance, where even minor deviations from expected norms were carefully considered and often avoided. Yet the system was not entirely rigid. Local officials sometimes exercised discretion, whether out of personal judgment, bribery, or practical necessity. Peasants learned to negotiate, appealing to sympathetic sipahis or qadis to adjust assessments, defer payments, or reinterpret rules. Merchants relied on similar strategies, cultivating relationships with inspectors and provincial administrators to reduce fines, smooth inspections, or gain access to preferential trade routes. These negotiations required keen observation, social intelligence, and a willingness to engage with the nuances of bureaucracy, a skill set that extended far beyond literacy or numeracy alone. Over time, you might have observed patterns emerging within the administrative tedium. Officials became predictable in their inspections, collectors followed seasonal rhythms, and provincial offices adhered to certain procedural norms. Those who paid attention to these subtleties could gain advantages, whether through timely preparation of documents, strategic scheduling of payments, or the careful cultivation of reputations. Ordinary people developed an acute awareness of timing, procedure, and hierarchy, using these insights to navigate a system that otherwise seemed unyielding. Despite these adaptations, bureaucracy imposed costs beyond the practical. Administrative demands consumed time and energy, diverting attention from productive labor, family responsibilities, and social activities. Delays, disputes, and audits created ongoing uncertainty, reinforcing a sense of subordination to distant authorities. Ordinary people often felt that their lives were measured and evaluated more by records and ledgers than by the outcomes of their labor, a subtle but pervasive pressure that shaped daily existence. The bureaucracy also functioned as a stabilizing yet fragile backbone of imperial power. Through meticulous record-keeping, the state was able to mobilize armies, collect taxes, regulate trade, and adjudicate disputes across vast distances. Yet the system's reliance on human diligence meant that even small lapses, clerical errors, miscommunications, or local mismanagement could disrupt revenue collection or legal processes. Ordinary people, caught between the rigidity of procedure and the unpredictability of real life, had to navigate this tension continuously, balancing compliance with practicality. Ultimately, life within the Ottoman bureaucratic maze was a study in endurance. You learned to read registers as carefully as the land, to memorize procedures as thoroughly as routes to market, and to negotiate with officials as deftly as you negotiated crop yields or trade deals. The tedium of paperwork was not merely administrative, it shaped behavior, dictated rhythms, and structured society in ways that were subtle yet profound. Survival depended as much on understanding the rules of the bureaucracy as it did on cultivating land, raising livestock, or trading goods. And yet, questions lingered. How often did the imperfection of human administration alter the fate of villages, merchants, or families? How many disputes were resolved quietly, leaving no record? And how many mistakes went uncorrected, silently shaping lives over generations? Even as the bureaucracy maintained the empire, it created a landscape of constant negotiation, careful calculation, and persistent vigilance, an invisible but relentless force governing every corner of Ottoman life. The answers were not always visible, but the effects were unmistakable, leaving ordinary people to navigate a maze that was at once mundane, exhausting, and essential to survival. As decades passed, the pervasive influence of the Ottoman bureaucracy became increasingly apparent, not only in administration, but in the fabric of everyday life. For ordinary people, surviving under this system required more than labor. It demanded patience, attention, and a meticulous understanding of how the empire documented, assessed, and controlled resources. The bureaucratic machine was vast, intricate, and demanding, and it relied on countless invisible actors: peasants reporting crop yields, merchants maintaining ledgers, scribes copying records, and officials enforcing rules with relentless diligence. Without these ordinary people, the empire's grand achievements, from sprawling cities to military campaigns, could not have been sustained. For peasants, the bureaucracy shaped every season. The annual surveys, tax assessments, and inspections dictated planting schedules, labor allocation, and storage strategies. You learn to track records, anticipate collector visits, and reconcile discrepancies between state expectations and real-world production. Hidden grain caches, diversified crops, and careful accounting became essential survival tools. Families developed collective strategies to meet obligations, distributing labor across generations to ensure compliance. Endurance and attention to detail were as critical as physical strength in this environment. Merchants navigated an equally demanding landscape. Every shipment of goods required compliance with layers of documentation, customs, records, provincial ledgers, and municipal inspections. Mistakes could be costly, and success depended on both skill in trade and mastery of bureaucratic procedure. Relationships with officials became essential for smoothing inspections, negotiating exemptions, or resolving disputes. Commerce was not only a question of supply and demand, it was a continuous exercise in administration, record-keeping, and strategic negotiation. The human energy invested in this bureaucratic dance was immense, yet largely invisible to the outside world. Scribes and officials bore the internal burden of the system. Their work was repetitive, meticulous, and essential. Surveys had to be conducted accurately, registers maintained without error, correspondence drafted, copied, and filed for posterity. Mistakes could cascade through the empire, affecting revenue, legal rulings, and social stability. Life as a scribe demanded endurance, focus, and an acceptance of monotony, and yet the work itself shaped the mechanisms of power. Every ledger entry, every calculated quota, was a brick in the vast edifice of Ottoman administration. The bureaucracy also shaped social and psychological realities. Ordinary people learned to operate within its parameters, developing strategies to survive, adapt, and occasionally benefit. Villagers memorized patterns in inspections. Merchants tracked seasonal rhythms of taxes, and families negotiated discreetly with officials to reduce burdens. Compliance was often tactical, a balance between fulfilling obligations and preserving enough autonomy and resources for survival. In subtle ways, the system cultivated skills, record-keeping, negotiation, patience, and foresight that extended beyond immediate necessity. Yet, the human costs were real. Time and energy devoted to paperwork, inspections, and compliance diverted attention from other forms of productivity or leisure. Errors, disputes, and procedural delays created stress and uncertainty. Entire communities could be destabilized by misrecorded data, misinterpreted rules, or the uneven discretion of local officials. Even when the bureaucracy functioned as intended, it imposed a relentless rhythm on life, shaping behavior, labor patterns, and social interactions in ways that were both invisible and unavoidable. Still, despite its burdens, the bureaucracy ensured the survival and coherence of a vast empire. Through meticulous record-keeping and administration, the Ottoman state could collect taxes, conscript soldiers, adjudicate disputes, and regulate trade across 3 continents. Ordinary people, often overlooked in grand narratives, were the linchpins of this system. Their diligence, endurance, and adaptability allowed the machinery of empire to operate smoothly. The monumental architecture, military campaigns, and political stability that are often celebrated in history depended on countless unseen contributions on the labor of peasants, the skill of merchants, and the meticulous work of scribes and officials. Over time, you might observe that the system created patterns of stability, as well as fragility. Consistency in record-keeping allowed the state to plan, mobilize, and govern distant provinces. Yet small errors, miscommunications, or local abuses could ripple through the empire, leaving ordinary people to absorb the consequences. The system was simultaneously rigorous and vulnerable, disciplined, yet dependent on human diligence. Navigating it required attention, adaptation, and endurance, a combination that defined life under Ottoman administration. The ultimate lesson of this bureaucratic maze is subtle but profound. Empires, even vast and powerful ones, depend on ordinary people, maintaining systems that often appear mundane or tedious. The Ottoman bureaucracy was remarkable not because of dramatic actions or heroic exploits, but because it relied on repetitive, patient, and largely invisible labor. The empire's success rested on the quiet endurance of those who recorded, reported, and complied, those who negotiated, calculated, and persevered, those whose meticulous work transformed complex governance into a functioning system over centuries. And as you reflect on this, a question lingers. How much of history is shaped not by battles, laws, or conquests, but by the relentless, invisible work of ordinary people within bureaucracies? How many empires have risen and fallen not because of generals or kings, but because of the unnoticed efforts, errors, and adaptations of those tasked with paperwork, record-keeping, and compliance? The answers are elusive, yet the traces remain in ledgers, registers, tax records, and the quiet persistence of daily life, revealing the hidden engine behind the machinery of history itself. If you imagine the Ottoman Empire as a realm of powerful sultans, sprawling cities, and military conquests, it is easy to overlook the quiet, persistent crises that shaped everyday life for the majority of its subjects. Beyond palaces and armies, ordinary people, peasants, merchants, and artisans lived under constant exposure to environmental hazards, crop failures, and bureaucratic inefficiencies. These crises were not spectacular in the way of battles or revolts, but they were no less consequential, determining whether a family survived, whether a village endured, and whether communities persisted or disappeared. In this sense, the mundane disasters of daily life were as critical to the empire's history as any victory or decree. Consider a small village in Anatolia in the late 16th century. The year began like any other, with farmers ploughing fields, sowing seeds, and tending animals. The timing of the rains, the consistency of the soil, and the health of livestock determined how much food would be available at the end of the season. A minor deviation in weather could have a cascading effect. A late frost might destroy wheat shoots, heavy rains could wash away young seedlings, and pests could decimate crops within days. Unlike modern societies with storage, transportation, and relief systems, villages relied on local reserves, communal support, and careful anticipation to survive. One failed harvest could mean weeks or months without sufficient food. Floods, too, were a recurring threat. Rivers provided the lifeblood for irrigation and transportation, but when waters rose beyond their banks, entire fields could be submerged. Buildings made of mud brick or timber, common in provincial towns, could be destroyed, leaving families homeless or without essential storage for grain and tools. Floods often coincided with epidemics, as standing water attracted mosquitoes and facilitated the spread of disease. Recovery was slow and laborious. Fields had to be cleared, seed replanted, and homes rebuilt. In some regions, Chronic flooding prompted villages to relocate entirely, leaving only faint traces of human habitation in subsequent records. Famine, a consequence of repeated crop failures or environmental misfortune, was an ever-present spectre. It did not strike uniformly, but could devastate individual provinces, while neighboring regions remained relatively unaffected. Grain shortages led to rising prices, forcing households to ration carefully, sell livestock, or borrow from wealthier neighbors. In more severe cases, villagers abandoned fields, migrated to towns or less affected provinces, or depended on local charitable networks, including waqfs, religious endowments, that distributed food to the needy. Even in less extreme circumstances, the psychological burden of anticipating famine shaped decisions: how much to plant, how much to consume, and how much to hide for emergencies. Survival required not only physical labor, but foresight, planning, and constant vigilance. These crises were exacerbated by the empire's administrative and logistical limitations. Tax assessments rarely accounted for local environmental conditions, so peasants might owe the same amount of grain or money during a poor harvest as they would in a bountiful year. Provincial officials were expected to maintain quotas, and failure to deliver revenue could result in punishment or reassignment. Similarly, the empire's distribution networks for grain or other resources were often slow and inefficient, meaning that relief could arrive too late or be insufficient to prevent widespread suffering. Ordinary people bore the brunt of these failures, managing scarcity while ensuring that obligations to the state were still met. The human response to such crises involved a complex mix of ingenuity, adaptation, and community effort. Villagers developed storage techniques designed to protect seed grain from moisture, pests, or theft. They rotated fields and planted drought-resistant crops alongside staples, diversifying production to hedge against environmental unpredictability. Livestock were moved to higher ground during floods, and families carefully rationed resources to stretch reserves through lean periods. Social networks were essential. Neighbors exchanged food or labor. Families lent money or grain, and local leaders organized communal efforts to rebuild infrastructure after disaster. Survival depended on observation, experience, and a collective understanding of risk that was rarely recorded outside local memory. Merchants and urban residents experienced these crises differently, but no less acutely. Supply disruptions led to price volatility, scarcity of essentials, and social tension. Merchants had to navigate not only market forces, but also administrative controls, emergency levies, price regulations, and occasional requisitions by provincial authorities seeking to stabilize urban centers. In some cases, merchant networks facilitated the redistribution of goods, but such interventions were uneven and dependent on timing, logistics, and personal connections. Even well-planned trade routes could be disrupted by flooding, banditry, or bureaucratic delay, highlighting the fragility of commerce in the face of natural and administrative crises. Epidemics often accompanied environmental disasters, compounding their impact. Contaminated water, malnutrition, and overcrowding in relief shelters created conditions for disease to spread rapidly. Ordinary people had limited medical knowledge and few effective remedies. Communities relied on religious guidance, herbal treatments, and traditional practices, often with only partial success. Mortality could be high, leaving families bereft of labor and further straining communal support structures. Recovery from such events required years of careful management, strategic labor allocation, and sometimes migration to less affected regions. In every case, crises exposed the interdependence of environment, administration, and social organization. Peasants were not merely passive victims, they were active participants in managing scarcity, negotiating obligations, and ensuring the continuity of their communities. Merchants, scribes, were similarly entangled, balancing survival, compliance, and profit. The empire's vast scale meant that disasters were localized, yet their ripple effects, migration, price fluctuations, labor shortages, reached far beyond individual villages. Ordinary life, in its quiet repetition, became a testament to resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to navigate adversity. Even as people endured, questions persisted. How many villages were permanently abandoned due to repeated famine or flooding? How many families survived only through painstaking calculation, resource sharing, or migration? How often did environmental and bureaucratic failures intersect, creating compounded crises that shaped the demographics and economy of entire regions? The historical record rarely preserves these details, leaving modern observers to reconstruct lives from scattered registers, anecdotal accounts, and administrative reports. Yet the patterns are clear. Ordinary people endured far more than their records suggest, and the empire itself was sustained not only by armies or taxation, but by their quiet, persistent management of everyday crises. And so, as the seasons passed and the rivers swelled, as crops failed and markets fluctuated, you might pause to consider the unseen labor, foresight, and adaptation that allowed ordinary people to survive. Even in the absence of heroic deeds or dramatic events, these crises, repetitive, tedious, and relentless, shape the rhythm of life, the resilience of communities, and ultimately, the endurance of the empire itself. You are left to wonder, how much of history is built not on conquest or decree, but on the quiet, tireless work of ordinary people, managing a world that is often unforgiving and unpredictable? As you became more familiar with life in the Ottoman provinces, it would have been clear that crises, whether famine, flood, or administrative failure, were not isolated incidents, but recurring patterns that shaped the rhythm of survival. These events were entwined with the empire's broader systems of governance, taxation, and trade. The unpredictability of nature, combined with the rigid expectations of bureaucracy, created an environment where endurance, foresight, and social cooperation were essential for ordinary people. Famine, the slow but relentless spectre of subsistence failure, forced villagers to plan years in advance. You would have observed households keeping meticulous records of seed reserves, livestock births, and stored grain. Contingency plans were essential. Some families allocated portions of their harvest for immediate consumption, some for seeds, and others for tax obligations. Miscalculations could be fatal. Peasants learned to prioritize essentials over luxury, rationing food carefully, and ensuring that even during lean periods, there was enough to sustain the labor required for survival. In some cases, families borrowed from neighbors, creating reciprocal obligations that reinforced communal networks. These networks were delicate. Failure to repay debts could fracture relationships or weaken mutual support systems, leaving households more vulnerable in subsequent crises. Floods, while sudden and dramatic, often had long-term consequences. Crops were destroyed, fields rendered unusable, and homes damaged. Repairing damage required both labor and material resources, which were often scarce in provincial villages. Communities responded by developing localized knowledge of river patterns, soil conditions, and seasonal weather trends. You would have witnessed villagers constructing raised storage platforms, reinforcing dikes, and planting flood-resistant crops, demonstrating an intimate understanding of their environment. Such adaptations were subtle and often invisible to imperial officials, yet they were crucial for survival. Despite preparation, however, severe floods could overwhelm even the best-laid plans, forcing temporary or permanent migration. Migration itself became a recurring feature of life in flood or famine-prone regions. Villagers sometimes relocated to higher ground, less affected regions, or urban centers, seeking employment, shelter, or access to relief networks. These movements were rarely dramatic, often gradual, household by household, but cumulatively, they reshaped local demographics. Entire regions could experience depopulation, leaving once thriving villages in ruins. Those who remained often absorbed incoming migrants, creating new social dynamics, labor arrangements, and communal responsibilities. Survival in the Ottoman provinces was therefore not static. It required constant negotiation between environmental risk, social networks, and administrative obligations. Administrative failures further complicated the picture. Tax assessments rarely accounted for localized disasters, leaving villagers to shoulder obligations despite reduced productivity. Provincial governors were under pressure to remit quotas to Istanbul, so exceptions were rare and inconsistently applied. Relief efforts, when attempted, were slow and uneven, often limited to areas of strategic or economic importance. You would have seen villagers compelled to pay taxes in cash or kind, even during years of scarcity, forcing them to sell personal property, borrow, or work additional labor to meet obligations. The gap between imperial expectation and local reality was a constant source of tension, shaping behavior, decision-making, and social organization. Merchants were also affected, though in distinct ways. Disruptions in harvests or transportation delayed shipments, inflated prices, and created uncertainty in markets. Urban centers experienced scarcity, and food imports became essential, leading to reliance on complex trade networks that were themselves vulnerable to bureaucratic delays, banditry, or environmental factors. Merchants adapted by maintaining diverse trade routes, stockpiling goods in anticipation of shortages, and cultivating networks of contacts to secure priority access to supplies. Yet even with careful planning, the combination of natural and administrative crises created volatility that affected livelihoods and survival strategies. Social and psychological adaptation was a central feature of this environment. Ordinary people developed routines to anticipate and mitigate risk, ranging from crop diversification to storage techniques. From labor-sharing agreements to debt management, communities reinforced social norms that encouraged cooperation, as collective effort increased the likelihood of survival. Knowledge of local terrain, river behavior, seasonal patterns, and administrative procedures became critical. In many ways, survival required skills as specialized and disciplined as those of the scribes, merchants, or tax collectors who administered the empire. Over time, these crises revealed both resilience and fragility in Ottoman provinces. Villages and urban centers persisted despite repeated challenges, demonstrating the ability of ordinary people to adapt, innovate, and cooperate. Yet the same pressures could amplify inequality. Wealthier households, better connected merchants, or influential families could navigate crises with less risk, while smaller or less networked households faced greater vulnerability. Entire communities might vanish quietly, leaving gaps in records and memory that obscure the true scale of suffering. Survival, therefore, was as much about strategic adaptation as it was about raw labor or resource availability. Even more subtly, recurring crises shaped long-term behaviors, social structures, and settlement patterns. Migration, adaptation to environmental hazards, and strategic labor allocation influenced local economies and demographic trends over generations. Children growing up in these conditions learned early the importance of observation, planning, and cooperation. Knowledge of past floods, harvest failures, and bureaucratic mismanagement became embedded in community memory, guiding future decisions. These cumulative adaptations allowed the empire to function despite the fragility inherent in a system reliant on local production, administrative efficiency, and environmental stability. Yet, a lingering question persists. How many subtle crises went unrecorded, leaving invisible scars on communities and families? How often did environmental disaster intersect with bureaucratic inefficiency, compounding hardship in ways that official records failed to capture? And, perhaps most importantly, how did ordinary people, through quiet endurance, collective effort, and practical ingenuity sustain life under pressures that were constant, relentless, and often invisible to those at the top of the empire. These questions underscore the hidden human labor and resilience that supported the Ottoman state, reminding us that history is shaped as much by ordinary endurance as by extraordinary events. Over decades, the interplay of famine, flooding, and administrative shortcomings left enduring marks on the Ottoman provinces. Life under these pressures was not defined by dramatic battles or political upheaval, but by the slow, relentless rhythm of crisis and adaptation. Villages that endured learned to anticipate scarcity, while communities that failed often vanished quietly from the records. Ordinary people, peasants, artisans, and merchants were the silent actors in this ongoing drama, shaping survival strategies that allowed the empire to continue functioning despite its vulnerabilities. For peasants, the repeated threat of famine and flood required constant vigilance. Seed grain was stored with extreme care, livestock protected from unpredictable weather, and crops diversified to hedge against environmental variability. Some families developed intricate systems of resource sharing with neighbors, creating informal safety nets that distributed risk across households. In this environment, survival depended not merely on labor, but on foresight, meticulous planning, and cooperation. These strategies became embedded in communal knowledge, passed down through generations, forming the subtle backbone of rural resilience. Flooding, while destructive, also forced adaptation and innovation. Villagers learned to read river patterns, construct protective embankments, and relocate storage or livestock to safer ground. In areas prone to chronic flooding, settlement patterns shifted over time, with villages moving incrementally to higher ground or consolidating with neighboring communities. These migrations reshaped local demographics, labor organization, and even land ownership structures, demonstrating the profound long-term effects of environmental crises on ordinary life. Merchants, too, developed strategies to cope with uncertainty. Trade networks were diversified, goods stockpiled in anticipation of shortages, and relationships with officials cultivated to ensure preferential access during crises. Yet even the most careful merchant could not fully insulate against the combined effects of natural disaster, scarcity, and bureaucratic inefficiency. Success required constant calculation, attention to detail, and the ability to adapt quickly when circumstances changed, a reflection of the same skills honed by peasants and artisans across the empire. Administrative failures compounded the effects of environmental crises. Tax assessments often remained fixed despite local shortages, forcing households to sell property, borrow, or increase labor output to meet obligations. Provincial officials were under pressure to deliver quotas to Istanbul, creating tension between local realities and imperial expectations. Ordinary people learned to negotiate, appeal, or otherwise navigate these bureaucratic pressures, integrating administrative strategy into daily survival practices. Endurance was therefore both physical and cognitive, involving careful management of resources, relationships, and procedural knowledge. Despite these hardships, communities displayed remarkable resilience. The repeated experience of crisis fostered a culture of adaptation and mutual support. Social norms encouraged cooperation, reciprocity, and careful observation of local environmental patterns. Children learned from an early age how to manage scarcity, repair infrastructure, and support communal efforts. Knowledge of past famines, floods, and bureaucratic errors became embedded in collective memory, guiding future decisions and strengthening local survival strategies. Ordinary life was shaped as much by these quiet lessons as by formal education or official decree. The consequences of recurring crises also extended to broader social and demographic patterns. Villages that survived flourished cautiously, while less resilient communities declined or disappeared, leaving behind traces only in fragmented records. Migration altered the distribution of labor, skill, and population density, affecting both rural and urban economies. Merchants and artisans adapted to fluctuating markets, ensuring the flow of goods despite environmental or administrative obstacles. These adjustments, often invisible in traditional historical narratives, were critical to the continuity of provincial life and, by extension, the stability of the empire as a whole. In this context, the Ottoman Empire itself can be seen not only as a political and military entity, but as a system sustained by ordinary human labor, adaptability, and resilience. The bureaucracy, taxation, and imperial directives were critical, yet their success depended on how people on the ground navigated crises. Survival required meticulous planning, strategic resource allocation, and social cooperation, all carried out under the constant threat of famine, flood, or administrative failure. The empire's endurance was therefore inseparable from the quiet, persistent efforts of its subjects. And yet, the record remains incomplete. How many villages quietly disappeared under repeated environmental and administrative stress? How many families survived only through careful calculation, cooperation, and endurance? How often did these crises influence broader imperial policies, trade networks, and population patterns in ways that were invisible to contemporary observers? The answers are partially hidden in ledgers, chronicles, and anecdotal accounts, leaving us to reconstruct a world where ordinary lives were defined by persistent adaptation to the unforgiving realities of nature and bureaucracy. Ultimately, the story of famine, flood, and failure in Ottoman provinces is a story of resilience in the face of relentless adversity. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by sultans, armies, or political decrees, but by the cumulative labor, foresight, and endurance of ordinary people. These quiet actors navigated environmental hazards, administrative rigidity, and social challenges, ensuring both personal survival and the continuity of communities. Their persistence forms a hidden, essential layer of history, a testament to human adaptability in a world where the mundane, tedious, and often frustrating rhythms of daily life determined the fate of entire regions and, ultimately, the empire itself. When most people think of the Ottoman Empire, their imagination is often filled with visions of lavish palace banquets, ornate kitchens serving sultans, and the exotic spices that traveled across continents. What is rarely considered, however, is the reality for the vast majority of the population. Ordinary people, navigating the mundane but relentless challenge of obtaining, preparing, and preserving enough food to survive. For peasants, artisans, and urban laborers, the kitchen was not a place of luxury, but a site of calculation, improvisation, and sometimes despair. A center of survival that shaped daily life, more than any sultan's feast ever could. In rural villages, food production was a constant concern. Fields had to be sown and tended not only to provide for the family, but also to meet obligations to the state in the form of taxes and levies. Grain was the staple wheat, barley, or rye, and its management dictated much of the rhythm of life. Farmers had to calculate carefully how much to consume, how much to reserve for seeds, and how much to store for emergencies. Too little stored grain meant vulnerability during lean months. Too much left unconsumed risked spoilage. Families often relied on simple storage methods, such as clay jars, straw-lined pits, or raised platforms to protect against moisture and pests. Even the most basic storage required vigilance and regular maintenance, turning the act of preserving food into a repetitive, ongoing labor. Meals themselves were simple, repetitive, and driven by necessity rather than taste. Breakfast often consisted of bread or flatbreads, sometimes accompanied by pulses like lentils or chickpeas. Vegetables, if available, were seasonal, often sourced from small kitchen gardens near the home. Meat was rare for most villagers, reserved for festivals, occasional market purchases, or the rare slaughter of livestock. Dairy products, yogurt, cheese, and milk supplemented diets when available, but were subject to seasonal fluctuations. For many, the distinction between hunger and sufficiency was delicate. The work of the kitchen was as much about rationing and efficiency as it was about cooking. The urban kitchen presented a slightly different challenge. Artisans, laborers, and shopkeepers relied on market purchases, homegrown herbs, or small-scale poultry and livestock to feed themselves and their families. Markets were busy centers of exchange, but also sites of scarcity, where prices fluctuated with harvests, transport disruptions, and local demand. You might have observed merchants haggling over grains, dried legumes, or preserved fish, carefully, measuring quantities to maximize sustenance while minimizing expense. Urban kitchens, like their rural counterparts, demanded constant attention to storage, spoilage, and seasonal variability. Cooking was a practical necessity. The preparation of food was inseparable from the broader task of survival. Spices and flavorings, often associated with opulent palace cuisine, were far less common among ordinary households. Salt, dried herbs, and occasionally imported spices might appear, but cost and availability constrained usage. Meals were dictated by what could be grown, gathered, or purchased locally. In rural areas, wild herbs, seasonal greens, and foraged roots supplemented diets. Urban households relied on trade networks to access items like olive oil, dried fruits, and preserved meats. Even with limited ingredients, culinary knowledge how to combine pulses, grains, and seasonal vegetables to create filling and nutritious meals was crucial. Food preparation was, in essence, a skill in survival, a daily negotiation between availability, need, and effort. Preservation techniques were similarly pragmatic. Drying, salting, fermenting, and smoking were common methods, allowing families to store food across seasons and buffer against scarcity. These methods required careful attention. Improperly dried grains or salted meat could spoil quickly, wasting labor and resources. Households developed intricate routines for rotating stock, checking for pests, and maintaining cleanliness. The kitchen was a microcosm of resource management, where survival depended as much on organization and observation as on agricultural productivity or market access. The role of women in food production and management was central. Women coordinated planting, tending, harvesting, and storage in rural households, while also preparing daily meals, preserving food, and maintaining household efficiency. In urban settings, women often balanced work outside the home with the equally demanding tasks of feeding and sustaining families. Culinary labor was continuous, repetitive, and rarely recognized beyond the household, yet it was essential. The ability to stretch limited resources, prevent spoilage, and maintain nutrition directly affected survival and family stability. Even in times of relative abundance, hunger and scarcity were never far away. Crop failures, delayed harvests, and market disruptions could quickly strain supplies. Households had to ration carefully, adjust diets, and sometimes rely on borrowing or social networks to bridge shortfalls. Festivals and special occasions offered rare indulgence, but these moments highlighted the contrast with ordinary scarcity, reinforcing awareness of the ever-present need for careful planning and resource management. Survival was measured not in culinary delight but in the quiet success of making food last through uncertainty. Moreover, these challenges were intimately tied to broader environmental, economic, administrative factors. Poor harvests might coincide with bureaucratic demands for grain or cash, amplifying scarcity. Floods or droughts disrupted production, transport, and storage. Market fluctuations reflected regional and even imperial conditions, from trade disruptions to famine in distant provinces. The act of feeding a household was therefore a multi-layered task, integrating observation of local conditions, knowledge of bureaucratic obligations, and practical management of limited resources. Food was not merely sustenance, it was a focal point around which the entire rhythm of survival revolved. In such a context, even the mundane tasks of the kitchen, grinding grain, tending a fire, checking stored vegetables, washing utensils, took on profound importance. Each day's labor was both immediate and strategic, ensuring today's meal, while preparing for tomorrow's uncertainty. You would have observed families negotiating portions, calculating cooking times, and coordinating chores to maximize efficiency. The kitchen, often unseen in historical accounts, was a center of intelligence, endurance, and adaptation, reflecting both the challenges of scarcity and the ingenuity of ordinary people. And yet, despite careful planning, questions lingered. How many families survived by the narrowest margins, relying on minute adjustments and meticulous record-keeping of food and resources? How often did scarcity force migration, social dependence, or subtle shifts in local economies? And how did these daily struggles with hunger, preservation, and preparation shape the social, economic, and even cultural life of the empire in ways that remain largely invisible in the grand narratives of sultans and conquests? These questions hint at the hidden labor, endurance, and ingenuity that sustained ordinary people. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, and every meal was the product of careful strategy and constant attention. As you spent more time observing life in Ottoman villages and towns, it would have become evident that food management was far more than a series of daily chores. It was a continuous exercise in planning, foresight, and adaptation. Households were engaged in an ongoing negotiation with nature, markets, and the state. Survival depended not merely on production or purchase, but on careful rationing, preservation, and anticipation of scarcity. In rural households, the management of grain was paramount. Wheat and barley were both staple foods and currency for tax payments, which meant that families had to balance consumption with obligations to the state. You would have seen storage silos and clay jars meticulously monitored. Grain was rotated to prevent spoilage, inspected for pests, and carefully measured when distributed for meals. Families frequently kept hidden reserves, known as emergency caches, which provided a buffer against poor harvests, unexpected taxes, or theft. These reserves required careful secrecy, as knowledge of hidden stores could invite confiscation or social conflict. Even the act of storing food became a subtle negotiation between survival and compliance. Vegetables, legumes, and fruits were essential complements to the diet, but were highly seasonal. Garden plots were planted with a mix of staples and high-yield crops, designed to maximize both nutrition and caloric output. Seasonal rotation was critical. Peasants would alternate between early and late crops, plant drought-resistant varieties alongside more vulnerable ones, and rely on foraged plants to supplement cultivated food. Preservation methods, such as drying, pickling, and fermenting, were employed to stretch the lifespan of these perishable items, transforming the kitchen into both a culinary and a strategic space. Livestock management was similarly intertwined with survival. Chickens, goats, and sheep provided protein and dairy, but their care required significant labor and attention. Feed had to be rationed, shelters maintained, and young animals protected from predators and disease. Slaughtering occurred rarely, often reserved for holidays or emergencies, requiring households to balance immediate sustenance with long-term resource planning. In some regions, livestock served as a form of savings or emergency capital. Their value measured not merely in meat, but in their contribution to household stability. Urban households faced a distinct but equally complex set of challenges. Market dependency meant that fluctuations in supply and price had immediate consequences. Merchants and consumers had to track commodity prices, anticipate shortages, and negotiate access to scarce goods. A single delayed shipment could force rationing, substitution, or reliance on less desirable ingredients. Markets were hubs of both opportunity and risk, requiring urban households to be alert and resourceful. Even small urban kitchens became centers of meticulous organization. Ingredients were inventoried, storage conditions monitored, and cooking schedules adjusted to minimize waste. Communal strategies played a significant role in managing scarcity. Villages often shared grain reserves during lean periods, coordinated irrigation, or pooled labor to repair storage facilities or transport crops. Urban neighborhoods relied on informal networks, including guilds, charity kitchens, and waqfs, to redistribute food during shortages. Such arrangements were delicate, balancing reciprocity, obligation, and social standing. Failure to contribute or misuse resources could fracture trust, leaving households more vulnerable to famine or economic pressure. These networks reflect a profound understanding of interdependence and risk management within communities. The kitchen also served as a center of knowledge transfer. Culinary practices, preservation techniques, and rationing strategies were taught within families, ensuring that each generation could manage scarcity effectively. Children learned early to measure ingredients, maintain storage, and coordinate meal preparation with available resources. Observing the cycles of planting, harvest, and market fluctuations, they internalized lessons about seasonality, patience, and resilience. In this sense, food management was both practical and educational, a continuous process of learning, adaptation, and survival. Seasonal and environmental disruptions amplified these challenges. Poor harvests, floods, or locust swarms could deplete reserves quickly, forcing households to adjust meals, ration supplies, or seek alternative food sources. Bureaucratic obligations compounded pressure, as taxes and levies remained fixed despite local shortages. Ordinary people responded by improvising, substituting wild plants for vegetables, stretching grains with legumes, or relying on communal support. Adaptation was iterative and continuous, reflecting both ingenuity and the relentless demands of survival. Even the act of cooking itself demanded careful attention. Fuel wood, charcoal, or dried dung was limited and had to be managed efficiently. Pots, utensils, and cooking surfaces were maintained to prevent contamination or waste. Each meal was a product of careful calculation, quantity, preparation time, and nutritional balance all had to be considered. Cooking was labor-intensive and repetitive. Yet, it was inseparable from household survival. The kitchen was both a physical space and a hub of strategic thinking, where the invisible calculations of endurance played out in daily life. Social and cultural dimensions of food management also shaped behavior. Fasting, feasting, and religious observances imposed additional constraints or opportunities on diet and resource use. Household members learned to synchronize labor and meal schedules, coordinate contributions to communal feasts, and navigate the social expectations surrounding food. Culinary knowledge was not merely functional, it reinforced social cohesion, signaled status within the household or community, and reflected adaptive strategies for coping with scarcity. Yet, even with careful planning, uncertainty was constant. The success of each meal depended on a delicate combination of environmental conditions, resource management, market access, and bureaucratic compliance. Ordinary people had to anticipate challenges, respond flexibly to shortages, and maintain the physical and social structures that ensured survival. Life in the Ottoman kitchen was therefore defined by endurance, strategy, and adaptation, a continuous negotiation with scarcity, labor, and environmental unpredictability. And as you reflect on these rhythms, you might wonder, how many families survived by sheer ingenuity, calculation, and endurance alone, quietly navigating scarcity while maintaining household stability? How did these daily struggles with food shape broader social networks, migration patterns, and economic structures within villages and cities? And how much of the empire's longevity relied not on military campaigns or palace banquets, but on the persistent, invisible labor of ordinary people managing the mundane, yet essential task of feeding themselves and their communities. These questions linger, highlighting the hidden human effort at the core of survival and empire. Over decades, the routines, strategies, and struggles of ordinary kitchens in the Ottoman Empire